Welcome, everyone, to this episode of ISI Conservative Conversations. My name is James Davenport, and I'm your host this evening. We have brought these two gentlemen together this evening to debate the following resolution. Resolved, free trade is good for the poor. Attached to this resolution is the following mutually agreed upon proviso. Free trade is defined as America removing all barriers to its markets and eliminating government support for domestic producers. Joining me tonight in support of the resolution is Dr. Victor Claar. Dr. Claar is an associate professor of economics at Florida Gulf Coast in Fort Myers, where he holds the BB&T Distinguished Professorship in Free Enterprise. He studied business and math as an undergraduate at Houghton College in upstate New York and earned his master's and doctoral degrees in economics at West Virginia University. Professor Claar is an affiliate scholar of the Acton Institute, as well as a member of the Foundation for Economic Education's faculty network. Dr. Claar has written multiple books. His most recent book is with co-author Greg Forster, The Keynesian Revolution and the Rise of Economic Materialism. We're All Dead. You can find a link to that book in the top of the chat. And as you know, here at ISI, we introduce all our speakers with memes. And in the spirit of debate this evening, we have a special meme from the opposition for Victor Claar. And go ahead and put that up. I thought you two might enjoy that one.
Yeah, good one.
And also with us this evening, we have Mr. Oren Cass of the American Compass. Mr. Cass is the executive director of American Compass, whose mission is to restore an economic consensus that emphasizes the importance of family, community, and industry to the nation's liberty and prosperity. Prior to founding American Compass, Mr. Cass held roles as a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research, he was the domestic policy director for Mitt Romney's 2012 presidential campaign, and a management consultant in Bain & Company's Boston and Delhi offices. He is the author of Once and Future Worker, a vision for the renewal of work in America. And you can find a link to the American Compass website up above on the top of the chat. And now we also have a meme for Mr. Cass. Oh,
I can't see what it says.
Oh. It's
an Uno card.
Oh. Well, I'm sorry about that. That is, for some reason, not coming up properly. It's supposed to say, agree with the libertarian or draw 25, and Mr. Cass has chosen to draw 25. So we will move out of that. Apologize for the glitch there. So, moving on. We will now move on to opening statements. The format is we have 10-minute opening statements from either presenter on the resolution. And then we will have 5 minutes to rebut. And then we'll move into a moderated discussion and Q&A. For Q&A, make sure that over here on the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see the chat column directly above it where you see Q&A. Click there and go in and enter your questions down there so we can get to them at the end. So let's begin with Dr. Claar, and your 10 minutes begins.
Thanks, James, and thanks to ISI, and thanks to all of you for attending tonight. I feel like I've been given the easiest assignment ever. The resolution is that free trade is good for the poor. And I'll persuade you that free trade is a net benefit to the poor, and that anything less than free trade affects the poor adversely. I enjoy the advantage that my opponent, Mr. Cass, has chosen to define free trade in a very narrow way, removing all barriers to our economy and eliminating government support for its producers. So my job is to argue that this conception of free trade makes the poor better off than they would be otherwise, and I happily accept that challenge. Let me begin by stating that I share many of the concerns of my colleague. In fact, Mr. Cass and I are agreed on some of his own big picture goals that he expresses in places like his book or his testimony before the Senate. First and foremost, Mr. Cass and I agree that, as he put it to the Senate last year, and I'm quoting, "A labor market in which workers can support strong families and communities is the central determinant of long-term prosperity." Where we disagree is whether his particular mix of policy recommendations is likely to realize our shared goals, and in particular, to be better for the poor than a society in which free people discover how to be of service to others in our increasingly interconnected world. Mr. Cass is right to be concerned, and I address many of those same concerns in my own 2019 book with Greg, The Keynesian Revolution and Our Empty Economy. First, America really is haunted by a deep and growing anxiety about the structures of our economy, an anxiety that crosses across lines of ethnicity, class, religion, party, and ideology. It's been an equally powerful force in the stunning rise to power of former fringe figures like Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. In the Tea Party and Occupy Wall Street movements, in our current squabbles over mitigation versus opening the economy, and even at the kitchen tables of millions of ordinary, apolitical Americans. And it's not a mere selfish concern about who gets how much. It's deeper than that. It's a moral anxiety, a concern about what kind of people we are becoming. Is America still a place where we can honestly believe in the magic of the marketplace, to quote Ronald Reagan's famous phrase? Or have we become the kind of place where cheaters consistently get ahead, slackers get a free ride, and where the magic of the marketplace is a fraud? Second, even as economic structures dominated by aristocracies of the past are increasingly obliterated by the dynamic churn of global markets, our sense that the rich don't deserve their wealth and that the whole system is rigged against the little guy has steadily increased rather than decreased. People distrust and resent the economic system dominated by bankers and tech entrepreneurs, even more than they used to distrust and resent the systems that were dominated by kings and priests. You can see this feeling echoed in the stark contrast between economic policy debates now versus economic policy debates in the second half of the 20th century. Until recently, public debates about economics were dominated by technical questions about how the economy works. Those days are over. Third, Mr. Cass and I are fully agreed that GDP is not the gold standard for assessing economic well-being, and we also agree that Lord Keynes was mistaken when he famously claimed that consumption, to repeat the obvious, is the sole end of all economic activity. Indeed, economics isn't about consumption or even production. Well, it's about those things, but it's also moral and cultural. In fact, if we focus only on macroeconomic measures like GDP, the trade balance, or the price level as we craft economic policy, then policymakers end up playing the economy like a video game, manipulating their fellow human beings into activities that you and I would not otherwise freely choose in an effort to improve their score and have something to point to at election time. And fourth, the worst part of our anxiety is that nothing that we try seems to help. Politicians in both parties keep affirming their fervent devotion to America's traditional economic virtues: diligence, honesty, entrepreneurship, equal opportunity, and earned success doing work that makes the world better. They promise, and sometimes they even implement, ambitious plans to preserve our way of life. Yet somehow the scoundrels are always on top. The slackers never quite get out of their parents' basements, and the poorest Americans discover the system really is rigged against them. An anecdote from my book characterizes our areas of shared concern tonight. Not long ago, my co-author was riding around Omaha in an Uber and noticed an intricate dome made of small glass tiles fit together to form a beautiful pattern. My co-author noted out loud to the driver about the building's unusual and impressive architecture. "Yup," the driver responded, "I put in most of that glass." The driver, who looked to be about 75, explained that he had worked most of his life in window installation, and over the course of a long career had worked on most of the larger buildings in Omaha. Now that he was beyond the age for that kind of work, driving for Uber allowed him to stay connected to his professional legacy. "I feel pretty good driving around the city, seeing all the glass I put in," he said. But he said it with a bittersweet tone, one that suggested that it was not only in this driver's personal history that such things felt like they were from a bygone era, the world where people were allowed to care about that kind of thing, the world where your daily work amounted to something important, something whose worth couldn't be measured only in dollars and cents, seemed to belong to America's past, not just the drivers. Now, Mr. Cass would have you believe that Uber is the problem, that Americans need to make cars and not drive them. But that's a false choice. As an economist, I can tell you, both individually and socially, that Uber is a big win. In fact, one study suggested in 2015 alone, Uber customers benefited by $6.8 billion above and beyond what they spent on fares riding Uber that year. And of course, the drivers must feel like they benefit as well, otherwise they wouldn't drive for Uber. Uber and Lyft also strike a blow for equality. It used to be that only the wealthy could afford a regular car with a driver. Yet in the fall of 2016 alone, Lyft's drivers served 99.8% of Los Angeles County's population and were most likely to serve households that do not own cars, and regardless of race. But again, it's not about Uber. It may feel like it is, but it isn't. Instead, it's about whether we want to cultivate the sort of society that is fertile enough to unleash the creative genius that gives rise to modern wonders like Uber. And it's about whether a plan to dream up something like Uber could have happened sooner or better through government subsidies or other schemes. It's possible that today we'd have something better, but it's also possible those monies would have disappeared even faster than they did when they went to companies like Solyndra, Abound Solar, and Fisker Automotive during the last administration. And bear this in mind, nobody had conceived of Uber before Uber appeared. But we did know a thing or two already about solar panels and batteries in cars before we squandered $1.5 billion of other people's money on failed companies that I mentioned. The case of Tesla might be even more embarrassing. We've subsidized both production and consumption of a luxury car only the wealthy can afford. Before I conclude, let me make 4 short points regarding whether free trade is a better approach to the moral anxiety and social ills that affect us all, but especially the poor. First, anything less than free trade is coerced trade. It doesn't matter whether you're a populist on the right or a populist on the left, a nationalist or a socialist. Coerced trade isn't free. Second, nobody really knows what the right protectionist policy would be to accomplish our shared goals of thriving communities and meaningful work. For example, we've heard a lot about the American jobs we're saving in steel fabrication through tariffs, roughly 140,000 jobs. But what about the millions of workers in American industries who depend critically on steel as an input? Tariffs make steel more costly for them and put their jobs in peril. Don't they also deserve thriving communities and meaningful work? Third, even if we did know the right policy, the unintended side effects of protectionism tend to be worse than the benefits. They lead to awkward moments like Agriculture Secretary Sonny Perdue being confronted by Minnesota farmers who've been hit with trade retaliation from China, and they don't want or need a federal bailout. All they need is a chance to compete. And finally, there's no possible way in any possible universe that actual policy would be guided by what would truly benefit workers in the ways that I've described. Instead, it would be guided by cronyism. You can't pick winners and losers without picking winners and losers. And cronies will pay a lot to influence the rules to assure victory. But economic debates today are all about outrage. Socialists are outraged that we don't have free universal health care and college education.
Dr.
And
Claar?
nationalists, yes?
I'm sorry, that is 10 minutes.
Okay.
I'm sorry, sir. I did put my hand up for the 1 minute. I apologize
Okay.
if that was confusing. Mr. Cass, are you ready to make your 10-minute opening statement?
I am. Hang on. Let me get my timer out so that Well, thank you, ISI, for hosting this, and Dr. Claar for joining me. I think this is a very fun topic, and I'm glad we get to discuss it, even if we can't all be in the same room. I should start by saying that generally I think free trade is great. I think Dr. Claar and I agree that free trade is a good way to organize an economy and an ideal we should strive for most of the time. And generally speaking, we have free trade. For instance, we have free trade in our cities. We have trade amongst these United States. The problem is that the situation becomes more complicated when we try to extend free trade across legal boundaries, because that gives us markets encompassing multiple legal systems. Now, the most obvious difference is that you therefore have rules made by others influencing behavior in your market. And at the extreme, if, say, you open your market up to a authoritarian communist country of 1.4 billion people, you've now allowed the policies of that country to help define how your market is going to work. And so while we think of free trade and free markets as compatible or even synonymous, in fact, they are in tension. The more of our goods that we get from China, the less we can say our own market is truly free. Dr. Claar mentioned this idea that the choice is between free trade and coerced trade. But then that leaves us the question of what we do when we find out that Apple's supply chain includes forced Uyghur labor. Putting aside the human rights questions entirely, is it a free market if consumers in the United States are buying iPhones made with forced labor? In a very different context, what about intellectual property protection? We obviously use patents. Patents are, of course, policies that specifically interfere with free trade among consenting people because we think that, in fact, we will get better long-term outcomes if we put that intervention in place. But what do we do if we're trading with people who don't protect intellectual property? Should an American consumer be able to buy something from China that is made with obviously stolen intellectual property? Again, if the principle is simply we will have no barrier to our market, you might say yes. You might say no because that violates domestic law. But then we can just extend the hypothetical a little further. What if the Chinese government provides subsidies to Chinese producers so that they can effectively license intellectual property for free? Well, now they can behave like there are no patents, and the products that come into our market will be made under those conditions. So it seems to me that while we might prefer a world of liberal democracies, we have to make policy in the world we have. And by the way, even liberal democracies are not immune from abuse. Even in our trade with the European Union, for instance, we face constant challenges of policies pursued by each side to advantage its own producers at the other's expense. And so what we're left with as policymakers is actually very different from what we're accustomed to in the domestic policy context, where we choose the rule that we want to go.
Mr. Cass?
Excuse us, everyone. I apologize. So one thing is about the labor market. We want to be operating an economy in which people of different abilities in different places can find good jobs that are going to allow them to support.
Mr. Cass, excuse me.
Families. Yeah.
Sorry, you cut out for about 20 seconds.
Oh. What was the last thing I said?
If you would like to go ahead and resume, I apologize. I've paused your time. And you were at, yep. So
what's the last thing I said that you did hear?
You were talking about the patents in relation to China.
I will pick up right there.
Right.
So, intellectual property protection is a very interesting issue where we think that protecting it is obviously conducive to a healthy free market. And yet, if we expand our market to include places that don't protect it, we have a real policy challenge on our hands. And so ultimately, the analysis that we have to undertake is very different from what we're used to in the domestic policy context, where we choose a rule, assuming that rule will govern. We have a game theory problem. We have to choose an optimal strategy, given that others are choosing their own strategies. And so the question then, I think, is what are we optimizing for? As Dr. Claar said, and I certainly agree, this isn't just a matter of maximizing consumption. But what do we want? Well, one thing we certainly want is production. We want a labor market that's going to provide good opportunities for people. I think we want a broad and diversified economy. And we want an economy that's on a positive, productive trajectory. And this is a really important point, that analyses of free trade as optimal are point-in-time analyses. They say this maximizes welfare at this moment, without consideration to what is actually going to yield the most investment in growth and innovation over time. And so I like to quote something that Andy Grove, the longtime CEO of Intel, said about a decade ago. He said, Silicon Valley is a community with a strong tradition of engineering, and engineers are a peculiar breed. They're eager to solve whatever problems they encounter, If profit margins are the problems, they go to work on margins with exquisite focus. Each company, ruggedly individualistic, does its best to expand efficiently and improve its own profitability. However, our pursuit of our individual businesses, which often involves transferring manufacturing and a great deal of engineering out of the country, has hindered our ability to bring innovations to scale at home. Without scaling, we don't just lose jobs, we lose our hold on new technology. Losing the ability to scale will ultimately damage our capacity to innovate. And I would argue that that's exactly what we've seen happen in this country across a wide range of industries and ultimately in the economy writ large, where productivity growth is down, dynamism is down, wage growth is down. We certainly have more cheap stuff than ever, but we do not have the broad, diversified, innovative economy that we want. Now, what would happen if we pursue Dr. Claar's proposal? If we actually just get rid of all barriers to our economy, get rid of all government support? Well, the first thing that would happen is others would restrict access to their markets more so than they do today. And we can say that's irrational and that's not what they should do, but we know that that's what they will do because we know that that's what they already tried to do. And our threat of restricting access to our market is the only way we keep others open. So in fact, right off the bat, we would end up with less free trade and a less free market than we have and than we want. The second thing is we would see a continuation of erosion of our domestic productive capacity because producers would move to places that are putting their thumb on the scale. Tesla is actually a fine example where, although the US obviously invested a lot in Tesla, Elon Musk has decided to set up his second production factory in China because China essentially offered to pay half the cost and said, this is the only way you're going to be able to sell your cars in our market. You can expect much more of that everywhere if the U.S. has unilaterally disarmed. The third thing we would see is we would have to cut off the government support that has in fact been vital to the development of virtually every successful technology we benefit from, including the internet you're watching this over, the chip in the computer that's allowing the video processing to happen, and so forth. Not to mention all of the healthcare innovations that we value and we typically celebrate as among the most important gains in standards of living. So all of that has come in as a function of public-private partnership and significant government funding, which certainly isn't perfect or always efficient, but I think unquestionably is better than not having it. The end result would be continued collapse of our labor market, erosion of industrial capacity, further slowing of productivity growth and innovation, and ultimately loss of national security. At some point, our ability to protect our nation and dictate our interests globally will go away if we have said we don't care what, if anything, we can make here, while other countries have said they care a great deal. So what should we do instead? I don't think protectionism is the answer. I think the first thing we should do is use access to our market to leverage free trade where we can. The right analogy here is to pacifism. What Dr. Claar has proposed is economic pacifism. And pacifism sounds very nice, but it is not a wise strategy on the world stage. Instead, you ensure that you have a robust military and you are actually better able to keep the peace if you do. So I think that should be one priority of ours. I think the second should be to invest and actually make sure that we are channeling capital toward industries that we know are going to be important to the long run health of the economy. Not playing venture capitalist with specific companies, but pursuing policies in our education sector, pursuing policies in terms of public-private partnerships like we have had for a long time in the semiconductor industry that actually ensure that investment goes to the things that will put us on the right long-term trajectory. Because markets are great for a lot of things, but markets and profit-pursuing individuals don't care about that trajectory. And if we do, we're going to have to do something about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cass. I appreciate that. I'm sorry, everyone, about the technical difficulties. These sorts of things, letting speakers know when a minute is up, and internet cutouts would all be easier if we were in person together. So I apologize for that. But moving on, now each debater will have a 5-minute rebuttal to the other's remarks. So, Dr. Claar, I will open it up to you next, and this time I will say 1 minute. I apologize.
Okay. Thanks, James. It's no problem at all. It's reassuring to know that Mr. Cass and I agree about so much, that Americans need to live lives of purpose and meaning, come home from the end of a day of productive work and feel really good about what they've done, and feel like they live in communities in which they can truly and authentically flourish as parents, friends, neighbors. One thing that Mr. Cass suggested is that we do have truly free trade in the United States. But I would take issue with that claim. In fact, I would suggest that one of the things that we could do easiest and most effectively to level the playing field for, in particular, the poor in America, is to try to undo the coercive systems in our own backyard that have locked the poor into poverty. If we were to brainstorm and reconsider domestic policies in areas like occupational licensing, residential zoning, and various forms of means-tested public assistance, that would do much more to promote the authentic dignity of work and thriving communities than any coerced socialist or nationalist industrial policy. Genuinely free trade, whether it's in the global economy or in the domestic economy, is what the poor need the most. I would also respond to the comment about child labor. Heaven forbid that I would ever have to be forced by my circumstance into having a child work alongside me. But if you think back to the beginnings of the United States, every American around 1800 lived in extreme global poverty. Using inflation adjustments, the average American, in exchange for a hard day at work that was hotter because there wasn't air conditioning, it was more dangerous. In exchange for that day at work, in today's money, most Americans worked on average for less than $1 a day in today's money. And it wasn't just the adults that were working, and it wasn't just the men. In many cases, it was everyone, because children had to work also in order for families to make ends meet. One of the wonderful things that we get to enjoy in the United States is that we have made significant economic progress. And so we may tell ourselves that the reason that our children no longer work alongside us is because we're better people now. No, it's because the power of markets, the power of freedom of choice, the power of international trade afforded us the luxury of being able to have our children in school, learning to be better people and productive workers in the next generation. During my Fulbright year in Armenia, I had assigned some readings to some of the MBA students that were very critical of globalization. And one student that I remember in particular knocked on my office door late one afternoon. His name is Artur. And he was very upset. And he'd read the readings that were critical of free trade and globalization. And he couldn't understand for sure whether he was bent out of shape by the authors or bent out of shape because he wasn't understanding the language very well. And we concluded that he was upset with the authors who were critical of globalization and free trade because he felt like they were audacious and dismissive and ignorant of what his particular life looked like in his circumstance. And he felt like he understood better than somebody else living an already nice life in another country, didn't understand the sorts of things that would make a typical Armenian like Artur have a better life and a better life for his children.
That's 1 minute.
Okay. One other thing that I'll mention is I agree with Mr. Cass. American healthcare is great. The problem with American healthcare, though, is that it's very, very expensive. And one of the reasons that it's so expensive is that, again, just like trade in many markets in the United States isn't as free as Mr. Cass has claimed, trade in healthcare isn't as free as it could be if we really focused our minds on making trade more free in that market rather than less free and more heavily regulated. The same is true for manufacturing. Onerous regulations are an impediment to developing new and better jobs here in the United States. And thankfully, the current administration has done a good job of unwinding some of those regulations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Claar. And now, Mr. Cass, you will also have 5 minutes to respond.
All right. Well, I suppose I would start with maybe something of a clarification, which is that when I say we have free trade domestically, I mean with respect to the kinds of barriers that exist globally. So we don't have tariffs and so forth between states. I agree absolutely with Dr. Claar that there are improvements that we could make on things like occupational licensing, zoning, and so forth. But of course, those have nothing to do with our international trade policy. They're certainly not in conflict with one or another international trade policy. Secondly, I should clarify when I was referring to the labor in China, it wasn't child labor, it was Uyghur labor. The Uyghurs are the Muslim minority population in Western China that is undergoing what borders on a genocide right now, including massive labor camps and widespread forced labor. And many of the things that they make then enter supply chains that reach the United States. And that is a reality of saying we are going to have free trade with no barriers with an authoritarian communist country that would do such a thing. I don't think we should tolerate that, and I don't think that's in the spirit of free trade. I don't think Dr. Claar, he can correct me, I don't think he would say it is either, but that was the example I was concerned about, not I think I might not be on. Everybody disappeared again.
Sorry, we can see.
I'm going to assume I'm not on until someone tells me otherwise.
Mr. Cass, are you able?
Sorry, I am still on. Okay, I just can't see the other videos. There they are. Sorry about that.
That's all right. That's all right.
Sorry, everybody. I got nervous there for a moment. So anyway, so it is the oppressive authoritarian tactics that we are allowing into our market that concern me in that instance. Finally, I think the interesting thing about the child labor example is that while Dr. Claar is certainly correct that circumstances in the U.S. were very different historically, I would say he is incorrect that it was the power of trade, as he describes it, certainly internationally, that brought America to its position of success. In fact, for virtually America's entire history, it pursued an aggressively protectionist policy. From Alexander Hamilton to Henry Clay, Abraham Lincoln, to William McKinley, all supported aggressive tariffs to protect domestic industries. And from the Civil War to World War II, during the period of in a sense, greatest American growth and expansion, the U.S. had the highest tariffs in the world. So that's not a conclusive argument in favor of them, but I do think it's important to recognize that the story we tell about how America built its economy is not one of the sort of policy that Dr. Claar is advocating here. Ultimately, in the arguments he made, I think he raised many great points in favor of free trade, but in my mind anyway, he didn't raise any that would argue for the sort of absolutist pacifist approach that I understand him to be advocating. He didn't explain why it would be preferable to unilaterally disarm rather than using access to our market as a tool to open markets elsewhere. And again, that requires imposing consequences on countries that don't pursue genuine open policies. And I feel like we didn't really engage the question of where the necessary long-term investment is going to come from. Certainly our healthcare sector is incredibly inefficient and over-regulated in many respects. But with respect to investment, the innovation that it drives, particularly in biotechnology, is extraordinary and leads the world and relies heavily on government support. So to understand what is going well in healthcare, I think we have to understand the role that government plays. To understand what has gone well in other technologies, I think likewise we have to understand the role that government investment plays. And that can be direct investment or merely policies that channel and reward investment. Things as simple as the R&D tax credit, which recognize that in the language of the economists, there are massive positive externalities to innovation that we are not going to capture if we don't have policies specifically aimed at rewarding it. And so while we pursue free trade globally, I think we also have to have a realistic view of how best to do that. And that means both being willing to use barriers and being willing to invest.
Thank you, Mr. Cass. And now we'll move on to 20-minute moderated discussion. However, first we're going to read a little word from our sponsors, the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. Are you tired of progressive orthodoxy on campus? Eager to go beyond the narrow range of debate in the classroom? Learn the timeless principles of liberty so that you can pursue truth and freedom. ISI introduces students to the American tradition of liberty and to a vibrant community of students and scholars. Our members get an education and a community they don't find at their universities. And in the process, they become articulate voices for conservative principles. To get the college education you deserve, become a member today at join.isi.org. All righty, and again, that was a brief word from our sponsor, the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. So now we'll move on to a moderated discussion, and I want to begin by asking both of you to flesh out more this problem of what is the bigger threat to the American economy? Is it China? Is it foreign powers, or is it government restrictions? What will have the larger negative effect on our economy, and especially for the poor?
James, could you repeat those three again, please?
Yes. So Dr. Cass Mr. Cass talked about how the threat of the Chinese on the government or on the economy without sort of protecting against those threats. And Dr. Claar, you cited government restriction as a problem to really providing meaningful work for the poor. And I wonder if you both could expand on that.
Well, I guess I don't see them as in conflict. In other words, I don't think there's a way in which we need to choose. We can in parallel try to pursue reforms to our domestic labor market, and I think we absolutely should, and also pursue aggressive policies to protect that market from, for instance, Chinese mercantilism. So it doesn't strike me as an either or something that requires ranking. And kind of interestingly, in the context that the debate has been framed, I suppose we already have all sorts of obstacles to trade. So the question might be, well, where should we focus on letting up on restrictions first? And there certainly, I would say the relaxing of restrictions needs to focus domestically.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, the problem of what to do when everybody doesn't unilaterally disarm, because I agree with Mr. Cass. One of the reasons that the 50 United States have flourished over time is because we don't have trade restrictions among our 50 states. North Carolina steel mills, micro mills can impose import tariffs on other producers from around the country. So there we're completely agreed. And in an ideal world, I would advocate the same sort of unilateral disarmament that Mr. Cass has suggested. The problem is that in the real world, even negotiated trade agreements aren't authentically free trade agreements like the ones we have among our 50 states. This is one of the reasons why pieces of negotiated free trade agreements are pages and pages of documents, because there are carve-outs everywhere for individual manufacturers, individual lobbyists, growers of one crop and not another crop. And so we are a little more free, perhaps on balance, as a consequence of the free trade agreement, but it's not an authentically free trade agreement. But the other question is, well, what do we do if it's not unilateral? It's a hard thing to know what to do when a trade war begins to escalate. And as I mentioned earlier, keep this in mind. An import tariff is a tax on Americans when they purchase a good that was produced elsewhere. So if you're an American company and you'd like to purchase some tires from China and make them available to your American customers at low prices, you pay for the tires that China's producing. Perhaps they're subsidized, perhaps they're not. But then you also pay a tax in the U.S. for the privilege of bringing those in. What's unclear is, in a world where disarmament is not unilateral, whether continuing to raise import tariffs and other import restrictions in the domestic economy like quotas against other countries that aren't very cooperative, whether that's a better strategy than not escalating. In the case of China, what we've seen is a lot of retaliation, lots of retaliatory tariffs intended strategically and surgically. And if you've seen this map, a lot of the retaliatory tariffs and import restrictions such as quotas that China introduced following the 2016 election were targeted specifically at Trump country. They targeted businesses that were physically located in districts that had voted for Trump. So you can increase your own walls. You can use tariffs to try to keep other products out, but you risk retaliation by the very people that you're trying to do business with.
Mr. Cass, would you like to respond to that?
Sure. I think the point about trade wars is exactly right. I don't think trade wars are good for anybody. But that again extends from the military analogy. Wars aren't good for anybody either. But that doesn't mean that you say, well, we don't ever want to get into a war, so let's just renounce all violence and disarm our military. Now, that would be a good way to not get into a war, but it would not be a good way to actually keep the peace in the long run. And so I would be the first to say I don't think the way that confrontation with China has been pursued was wise or effective. But that's very different from saying what we should have done in 2016 was, Donald Trump should have just said, you know what, I think what America really needs to do is just unilaterally drop all of its barriers. That strikes me as an incredibly irresponsible and unproductive way to proceed. And that goes much broader than just with China. We have a unique challenge with China, but we also have the rest of the world where we are able to manage, in most cases, a fairly effective détente of at least relatively open trade. But that, again, is something that is negotiated and has to be enforced and revisited by a clear establishment of a quid pro quo, by making clear that we are reducing our barriers in return for them reducing theirs. And if we want to maintain that, then we can't go the unilateral route. Thank
you, Mr. Cass. We have a question about the Uber and Lyft scenario. How much of the value created for Uber or Lyft passengers actually represents a wealth transfer from its investors to those passengers because of those companies' aggressive, quote, fake it till you make it strategy? Dr. Claar, would you like to respond to that since you're the one who brought up Uber?
Yeah, James, can you just clarify the question a little bit for me?
Yes. So he says, so he's asking about the wealth transfer from the investors of companies like Uber, who there's been this, I believe it was in Ross Douthat's book, where he talks about the fake it till you make it strategy. And so how much of the wealth is actually being transferred from the investors to the passengers because of those companies' strategy?
Yeah, I think in the case of these new technologies like ride sharing, it does require a lot of venture capitalists who are really willing to invest a lot of money because they think that over time it will pay off. People wouldn't do it, and they wouldn't invest their own money if they didn't expect to realize a return. Whether or not, in fact, the money that's used to get these launches off the ground is ultimately effectively used and pays off for the investors, that remains to be seen. But there's no question that, as I mentioned in 2015, consumers who used Uber alone were about $6.5 billion better off in terms of the services they got. So perhaps it's a transfer over the short term, but at least it's a voluntary transfer to make an investment in a new American idea. It's not a forcible transfer to get people to invest their hard-earned money in something they would never invest their own money in because they thought it would never pay off for them.
Mr. Cass, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, this idea that any interventions in the market would constitute forced transfers, I have a hard time accepting, because of course we do intervene in the market, and the sort of premise of an effective capitalist system is not one that has no interventions. It's one that has thoughtful interventions that allow markets to function well. So in my mind, the patent example is particularly instructive. When we issue a patent, we tell me that I can't go manufacture some patented drug myself and sell it to Dr. Claar. That is prohibited. And conversely, under Dr. Claar's description, we have forced people to invest in very profitable pharmaceutical development by issuing a patent. And yet that is exactly what we do, because we recognize that the way to get innovation is to, in fact, make sure that innovators are able to capture some of the reward. And so that mental model, I think, is a very powerful one, and one that we have to extend to ask where the situations where the unfettered exchange is not actually what's healthy for the economy's long-run trajectory. And when those exist, as with, for instance, our relationship with China, it's incumbent on policymakers to do something.
James, can I respond quickly? May I respond quickly on the patent point?
Yes,
I think
please.
that the question about patents isn't whether or not they're a good idea. I think, like most things in economics, there's a balancing act. On one hand, monopolies are bad. We know as consumers that monopolies are bad. This is why we have antitrust cases and antitrust law in the United States, because we know a lack of competition is bad. On the other hand, especially in some industries like pharmaceuticals, as Mr. Cass mentioned, if they're really developing life-saving new drugs, not similar drugs to ones that currently exist, but life-saving new ones, then we do want to create incentives for more of that good activity to happen. But the question becomes in the details, and one of the details regarding patent law is how many years should a patent be in force? The number of years has changed dramatically in my lifetime alone, and we continue to be tinkering with what's the right number of years to create an incentive to do something new, yet not see the monopoly hang around longer than it should and be ultimately to the detriment of customers.
Mr. Cass, would you like to respond as well?
Well, I would just clarify. So would you define that as coerced trade? However, whatever the ideal length is, does that fall into your bucket of coerced trade?
Yeah, it's a little bit different because we're not taking the actual earnings of our fellow Americans in order to force them to invest in the new thing. What we are doing, though, is we're surrendering some of the net benefit that they would get, especially over the shorter term, at lower prices. So again, I'm not saying that patents are good. I'm not saying that patents are bad. I am saying that if you're going to be in favor of patents, the first thing you need to think about seriously is how long the duration of a patent should be.
But so would you zero out NIH funding? We should have no government funding for research related to medical progress? Because that would certainly then be coerced trade.
Yeah, we're a very rich country, and we tax American taxpayers a lot. And we're able to do that because we are a rich country and we're prosperous and we've been very successful. One way to engage in that sort of activity is to have government grants, perhaps that have been funded through taxpayers. Another way to do it is through not-for-profit foundations that care passionately and deeply about making the world a better place, and perhaps attacking a pharmaceutical problem for which there currently is no market, maybe for something like malaria. And we've seen that with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation.
Mr. Cass, are you?
No, it seems to me then that we have a very clear medical industrial policy that Dr. Claar supports. We have government investment, and what government spends dwarfs by orders of magnitude what private foundations spend. We then have policies intervening in the market to restrict free exchange, to encourage and reward the innovators who translate that investment into products that we want. And we recognize that ultimately that is for the good. It's not perfect. There's industry capture and all sorts of other things. but that we want it to happen and that we can improve upon the outcomes we would have if we didn't do anything. And so we certainly should have a debate about how best to do that in other contexts. But I think it's important to recognize that I think the debate we are then having is how best to do it, how to determine where it makes sense, how to do it effectively, not whether this is either just in principle or viable in practice.
James, do I have 30 seconds to respond quickly before we go to closings?
You do, sir. You do.
Yeah, I think that the regulations that are the most pesky and the most obvious ones to do away with are the ones that were the most eager to suspend during a period of crisis. And we saw that during the coronavirus pandemic. Lots of regulations that used to govern us were suddenly off the table because they knew that they hampered us. And something that's restrictive in peacetime is even more complicating when you're trying to fight a war against something like the coronavirus. So I think that we need to re-examine which regulations really are working and which regulations have been put in place because, in this case, the medical industry lobby has made the playing field a little less level, and we see fewer discoveries and less innovation and less competition than we would otherwise.
I think we may have lost
James is gone.
We will have to self-moderate our conclusions. Do you remember how long they were supposed to be? Let's see what
I think 5 minutes each. So if we're going to finish, we need to start.
Sorry,
do you remember who goes first?
I apologize for that.
All right. I don't.
Yeah. Sorry about that.
I'm happy to. Actually, I'm not sure we were even supposed to have closings, but I guess we will. Do you want to go first? Oh, he's back. How are we supposed to?
Sorry about that, everyone. I apologize. There was a technical glitch. Yes, you guys can go ahead and move on to closings.
Okay. And what's the order? Who goes first?
Mr. Cass, if you would like to go first.
Sure. How long should we do? Like 3 minutes? What's good?
Yep.
All right. So I think this exchange has been very productive. And as I've tried to draw out, I think it's underscored that in these sort of complex contexts where you have overlapping legal regimes, where you have long-run investment at stake, the simple free market good, coercion bad model does not apply. I think likewise, there's been a significant amount of agreement that while in an ideal world, everyone would pursue free trade, in a world where that is not what other countries are going to do, we face a much more complicated situation. And I think a lot of the discussion has ended up focusing on deregulating domestic markets, which is terrific. I think Dr. Claar's point about the many regulations we discovered we didn't need during the pandemic is a very well-made one. I would just note that international trade rules were most certainly not among them. In fact, very much to the contrary, we discovered that in the face of a crisis, countries around the world very quickly shut down the export of products that we needed. And in particular, having allowed our supply chains to erode almost entirely, we found ourselves unable to produce what we needed. So it seems to me the lesson of coronavirus in this respect is absolutely we have some silly domestic regulations to get rid of, but just as absolutely the international system is very different. And simply applying the logic of free is good to a world where that is not how the other actors are approaching things is foolhardy, and it does not generate the outcomes we want. And very much to the contrary, it can leave us seriously exposed. And so as we think about how we build from here, I think one of the things we should feel comfortable saying is we would like to see supply chains move back to this country, that supply chains matter. You know, one thing that's been very funny is as all the supply chains were leaving and heading off to Asia, all of the economists said, don't worry, it doesn't matter where we make things. And now all of that, it's all there. And you ask, well, why can't we make an iPhone in America? The same economists laugh and say, well, of course you can't make it here because all the supply chains are in Asia. And it just makes you want to kind of slam your head on the desk. Supply chains matter. They matter to our national security. They matter to our capacity to innovate. They matter to the kinds of jobs we can create. They matter to how effective our investment is. And if we want to have strong domestic supply chains in a world where other countries are vying to take them, we are going to have policy that goes beyond the simple free trade good, coercion bad. And so that doesn't mean aggressive protectionism, but it means more than nothing.
That is 3 minutes. Perfect. Thank you, Mr. Cass. And Dr. Claar will move to you for 3 minutes, and then we will go to some Q&A.
Free trade is unambiguously good for the poor. In fact, the single greatest obstacle facing the poor in America is how unfair to the poor many markets are right here at home. And the poor feel trapped because they are. Tonight, I propose that as a nation, we rectify one of the most unfree markets of all, the market for education. Freer trade in the market for education would go a long way toward advancing the goals that Mr. Cass and I hold in common. The poorest Americans really are trapped. They're forced to send their children to the neighborhood public school, regardless of personal safety, the social interaction during the school day, or educational outcomes. Too many Americans are forced to send their children to a primary or secondary educational institution in which they have no choice, to face a curriculum in which they have no voice. If we don't like how life is turning out for the poorest Americans when they enter the workforce at 18, why don't we work harder to ensure that everyone can acquire not only the productive skills, but also the productive virtues that they need for success in their early formation? They'll be better prepared for the economy they'll face in the future, not only as future workers and entrepreneurs, but also as future parents, spouses, friends, and neighbors. So let's make trade truly free in the market for education. If we face a choice between spending $700 million in American manufacturing, as one presidential candidate has suggested last week, or comprehensively reforming education to make that market freer for all Americans, I think our odds of success are better with the latter and would yield benefits for generations to come. So that's why I'm calling for universal school choice, the freest possible market for children and their families in the market for education. We need to end local restrictions on charter schools. Parents should be free to decide which sort of public school they want to send their kids to, the public that's traditional or the public that's a charter. And any public monies for primary and secondary education should be as portable as possible. We already have an educational voucher system in the U.S. that many people think works reasonably well, though nobody calls it a voucher program. Most federal student aid for college is portable and can be spent at any institution, public or private, religious or secular, across the street or across the country. But I also firmly believe that universal school choice would open the door to a host of institutions that inform not only the mind, but also the heart, schools that build character as well as skills. Many families would give everything they could if given the necessary freedom and command of their child's funding to enroll their children in private institutions that build virtues like faith, hope, love, prudence, self-control, courage, and something we need most in 2020, a clear sense of what is truly just. To be sure, the family, together with social institutions like churches, bear the main responsibility for raising good kids. But I don't think it's asking too much to allow educational institutions to be responsive to the needs of families and kids. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you both very much for your comments here tonight. We're going to move to a couple student questions. The first one is from Giovanni DeSir, and the question is to both Mr. Cass and Dr. Claar, and it, again, will be related to China. It says, to Mr. Cass and to Dr. Claar, do you believe that the U.S. should compete against China the way the U.S. competed against the USSR in terms of outspending China and taking all of China's business with other nations in terms of offering nations who trade and do business with China a better deal, thereby forcing the communist government in China to collapse like the USSR in 1991 and allowing the U.S. to continue to be the world's only superpower? Why or why not? Who would like it first?
I'll start. I think we are certainly headed to something that looks more like a Cold War with China. And the most obvious sign of this is its recent crackdown in Hong Kong, and specifically a law extending globally and extraterritorially the prohibition on criticizing China. They've now said anyone who ever said anything bad about China, anyone in the world, can be prosecuted if they go to Hong Kong. And it is going to be increasingly not viable to maintain an open society that also tries to have an economy interlaced with a place that has those kinds of policies. So I think we will see a decoupling increasingly for geopolitical reasons, regardless of what one thinks about the economics. That said, I think our position vis-a-vis China is very different than what it was vis-a-vis USSR, in part because we have allowed all of our supply chains, or so many of them, to erode, and in part because China's size and scale is so much greater, and the world is so much more interconnected. So I think we will need an entirely new strategy, but than what we used in the last Cold War. But I do think we need to start asking the question, what does an effective strategy for a 21st century relationship like that look like?
Yeah, I think on that point, we're mostly agreed. There are dishonest practices that China's engaging in. Intellectual property is one that Mr. Cass has mentioned already. And we need to use the power of diplomacy and also the power of economics to try to dissuade China from doing things that we know they shouldn't be doing. One thing that's interesting is in the past, when we knew that a country was a very bad actor, we instituted a trade embargo, and we refused to do business with them. In particular, we refused to sell goods and services to them. In the case of a quota system in the United States, we're actually imposing a trade embargo on ourselves voluntarily and restricting the flow of goods and services from other nations. So I think that if the left and the right could come together and have an honest conversation about what it is that China is and is not doing, take a look at the track record, what activities have worked in reforming China the ways that we hope, what activities have worked less well, then I would think we would have a more productive conversation about what not only economic policy would look like, but also what other forms of diplomacy would look like as well.
Thank you very much. And we have a couple questions about the school choice comment that you made at the end, Dr. Claar. So here's one from Philip Cradle, and it is, how can universal school choice be supported as a part of absolute free trade, i.e., how would it be paid for?
Right. So this may be a case, and this is a conversation I have with other free market-minded economists. Some would say, well, having some choice is better than no choice at all. And that's what many Americans living in poverty in particular school districts that are demonstrably bad, that's the choice that they face, no choice at all. So on one hand, you're right. Using other people's money to send your child to school is using other people's money. But it's something that we currently do. It's the status quo. And no one is talking about reforming that. So it might be a libertarian dream to one day end publicly provided education, but I don't think that's very realistic, regardless of whether you think that we need true competition in the education space, or we simply need to reform it in a way that gives students access to other institutions besides the one that happens to be located within their particular district.
Thank you, Dr. Claar. Dr. Cass, or Mr. Cass, would you like to respond, or?
Well, I just emphasize that universal school choice has nothing whatsoever to do with the topic of this debate, which was about obstacles to the American market and support for U.S. domestic producers. I think we could have a great discussion about universal school choice, but at the point where the form of free trade that we're advocating for is school choice, I feel like the case for absolute free trade in the international context is probably not doing very well.
All righty, we have another question for Mr. Cass. It is, how would the government avoid picking winners and losers in the economy when determining trade restrictions, especially when access to international markets often fuels many profitable businesses in the U.S.?
Well, I think the goal is not to, first I'd say the goal is not to restrict access to our market, right? As with the goal of having a military is not to fight wars. The goal of having trade policy is to be pursuing the free trade policy. The situations in which I think we need to act differently are when we see, in two respects. One, when we see other countries distorting their markets. If you have a country like China that is stealing intellectual property, that is using coerced labor, that is subsidizing its own producers, those goods are not essentially free market goods. And so the two ways in which I think you want to act is, one, in a countervailing matter. That is, if China is going to subsidize things, those things should potentially face either restrictions on their entry into the US or tariffs when they do enter the US. And then secondly, what tools can you use to actually encourage China to pursue different policies? So it's actually funny in the education context. One thing I've always thought we should do rather than focus on tariffs is think about where do we have real leverage. And an example where we have real leverage is access to our higher education systems. I think telling China that we are going to restrict their access to our higher education system if they are not playing by the rules of the international trading system would be a very effective and targeted action that would very quickly get the attention of the elites in that country while doing relatively little to affect consumers in this country. So that's sort of bucket one, is you address the distortions you see elsewhere. And then bucket two is you look domestically at the kinds of investment that you think have substantial social value above and beyond what private actors are capturing. In a sense, it's the classic externality case. And so when it comes to things like the industrial economy, you have a situation where the health of the industrial economy has widespread benefits for innovation that are not going to be captured by individual producers deciding whether to remain domestic or move abroad. And so having policies that make it relatively more attractive to do business here, some of which are deregulatory. I think deregulation on things like an environment is a huge piece of it. Some of them are education related, making sure that we're providing the right kind of training for workers who would go into those industries. But then some of it, I think, is also supporting research and development that is going to go into those industries. And in some cases, it's using local content requirements to say something is a very important supply chain. And so we want to see it filled through American production.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Cass. Dr. Claar, do you have a response to that or the question originally posed?
I think my only response is whether or not these proposed policies would in fact deliver on what we expect of them. And I don't think the track record is very good in terms of using the sorts of policies that Mr. Cass has described to get a country to be a better actor than it currently is. I'd also like to point out just quickly that trade isn't everything. I think most economists know that we've had a trade deficit in the United States for a really long time. In fact, I think that the last time that we had a trade surplus with the rest of the world was in 1975, if I'm not mistaken. So we were in a recession. My memory's right. I think the unemployment rate was over 8% and the inflation rate was over 9%. And I don't know about anybody else, but I don't think back to those economic conditions in the domestic economy when we had a trade surplus. We sold more to the world than we bought from them. I don't think anybody wants to return to what the economy looked like in 1975.
Thank you, Dr. Claar. I want to move to a question that we have on the free trade of information. And people are asking about, generally sort of speaking, about how can we manage free trade of information in the internet age with large multinational corporations like Google?
I do not work in the data and piracy space, so sometimes you can fall in this trap of expertitis, and I will yield on that particular question. I think that's a question for people who do work in these areas. There's a private organization called Business Software Alliance that worked in some of the cases about data and downloading things like music sharing in the 1990s and 2000s. And I think we can look to companies like that to help us navigate those waters.
Mr. Cass, would you?
Well, I'm not a specialist either. I do think these are some of the places, though, where the problem of differing legal regimes is most dramatic, and that we face a problem of, for instance, some American tech companies saying, well, we just have to obey local laws, even if that means handing over data to the Chinese government, even if that means handing over intellectual property. And so I think, again, these are places where, well, I shouldn't say again, this is sort of another interesting example. We've talked a lot about externalities. We also have a collective action problem. We have a situation where individual companies that know what is happening in a place like China is not good for them, know that it would even be worse if they alone take a stand while all of their competitors rush in. And so I think there's also a case in these places, and potentially a public role is merely coordinating, but in others it may need to be more coercive to say, look, we know that either these practices are downright immoral or at least not in the national interest, and we understand that if any one of you takes a stand, you're going to lose. And so we're going to need to take an approach that says none of us are going to do that kind of business until we see reform. And if we don't, then that's a kind of business we're not going to be in.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Cass. We have one last question that we will address this evening, and it is directed toward Mr. Claar, but I think Mr. Cass, or Dr. Claar, but I think Mr. Cass will have things to say about it as well. How would you manage the challenges of censorship in the economy by foreign actors who exert controls over the companies that do business in the country? The example this questionnaire gives is the NBA putting Free Hong Kong on the back of jersey.
Yeah, I think it's very telling that NBA players have no problem insulting national leadership here in the United States, and they don't fear for their lives that there will be deadly consequences. I don't think you can have it both ways. I don't think you can be critical of your own domestic leadership and feel totally safe and feel like you have freedom of speech and it's protected, and not be critical of individuals and leadership in other countries where if you did say something even a tiny bit critical, you would go missing and no one would ever know what happened to you. So I do think that the NBA needs to be more honest and more forthright in terms of what they're doing and why they're doing it, and not apparently just chasing after money from Chinese markets, but instead be more open and honest and transparent. I see that they did, was it today? You can now buy a jersey, an NBA jersey that does say something about Hong Kong, but up until today, I think it had been forbidden and not available on the website.
Yeah, I entirely agree with that. I would just note that none of it is consistent with market logic. That if we're, I made the point that free markets and free trade are actually in conflict. Free speech and free trade turn out to be in conflict too. And if we want to preserve free trade in an open market, free speech in an open market society, then we're also going to have to be willing to take public action that makes sure our corporations don't face a situation where they have to choose between the kind of moral stance that Dr. Claar described that we'd like them to take and that they would probably like to take, and making as much money as possible, which, by the way, is their legal obligation under our doctrine of shareholder primacy. And so, once again, the simple, free trade generates the best results is not actually correct for the long-term health of this country. We can wish for that ideal world, but the real world that we live in is one where actors like China, I think, need to be dealt with differently.
Thank you, Mr. Cass. And thank you both for coming on with us here tonight. And thank you for joining us on ISI Conservative Conversations. Thank you, everyone in the audience, for coming. And thank you for your questions. And again, if you are interested in participating in any ISI events in the future, do go to join.isi.org and join ISI. Thank you all, and we'll see you soon on ISI Conservative Conversations.
This was great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.